to Black Girl Magic City. My name is Viola Ratcliffe, and I am super excited today because I have the opportunity to talk to someone that I talk to all the time about a variety of issues. It is my father, Dr. Darren Moten. Yay! So my dad is actually an author and a professor of the history department at Alabama State University. He is also the chair of the History and Political Science Department at Alabama State University, a vice president for the Alabama AFL-CIO, and the acting chair of the AFT Higher Education Policy and Planning Council. So one of the reasons why I wanted to have my dad on this platform is because we typically will talk about a variety of issues, ranging from everything from like sports to politics to what is happening currently in our culture, Black culture. But my dad actually wrote his dissertation when he was at the University of Iowa on a young Black woman named Virginia Christian. And when he wrote his dissertation, I was very young. I was only in like the 4th or 3rd grade. So I remember hearing about Virginia Christian just through conversation that I would overhear, but I never really knew too much about who she was. I was a little familiar the older I got because I did my own research, but I wanted to bring him on here because I think Virginia Christian's case is one that a lot of people are unfamiliar with, and it is one that I want to bring greater attention to and to discuss, especially in terms of violence against Black women and the Black Lives Matter movement and the things that are now coming to light in the conversations that we are beginning to have as a country about criminal justice system and Black women. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce my dad and actually have this conversation with him about who was Virginia Christian. So Dad, thank you so much for being on my platform today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is a real pleasure.
Oh, what I want to start with is, who was Virginia Christian?
Virginia Christian was an African-American teenager from Hampton, Virginia. She was born and raised in Hampton, Virginia. And she became the first female to be put to death in the Commonwealth of Virginia's electric chair. She is also the last juvenile female to be executed in the United States.
So when you were researching her, well, first, how did you even learn about her story? Because I'll admit, this is not something that I was ever formally taught. And definitely not in grade school, but not even in college. I never came across any type of class where she was mentioned. So how did you find out about Virginia Christian?
When I was at the University of Iowa, I took a women's history course. And for that course, I wrote a paper about a girls' reform school in Virginia. And the name of the school was the Virginia Industrial School for Colored Wayward Girls. And in the course of my research, I read an interview with Janie Porter Barrett, who was the second superintendent of that school, but also a very prominent African-American woman who was part of the Virginia Colored Women's Clubs. And the interview was with Mary White Overton, who was a board member for the NAACP. And what struck me was that Janie Porter Barrett said that she mentioned Virginia Christian's case and said that Virginia Christian's case was the inspiration for she and other Black women in the Virginia Colored Women's Clubs to create a girls' reform school, essentially to make sure that no other girl would meet the punishment or the fate that Virginia Christian met. And so that school was created to save Black girls who had gotten into trouble. So that's how I first learned of the case of Virginia Christian. And so I just put it aside because it was not the focus of my paper. The focus of my paper was the reform school. And then the University of Iowa Graduate College provided me with funding to travel to Virginia to do research. And that's where I really learned about the case of Virginia Christian.
Wow. And so for those of us who may be unfamiliar, including myself, I did do a little bit of research just recently, so I would be a little more refreshed on who she was. But she was a young Black domestic. She worked for an older white woman, I believe,
Yes.
and was accused of stealing from her
Yes.
and murdering her.
Yes.
And then she was arrested,
Yes.
and they prosecuted her and then sentenced her to death. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so Virginia Christian worked for a white female by the name of Ida Belote.
Okay.
She had worked for this lady or this woman since she was 13. And Ida Belote had accused her of stealing an article of clothing. Virginia Christian denied the theft, and Ida Belote picked up a slop jar or a cupsador and threw the contents of the cupsador on Virginia Christian. Christian became enraged, and there was an altercation that took place. Ida Belote began to scream. Now, this is all according to the court records. And Virginia Christian says that she took a rag that was nearby and placed it in Ida Belote's mouth to muffle her screams. The prosecutor alleged in court that Virginia Christian not only placed that rag in the mouth of Ida Belote, but she took a stick and pushed it or shoved that rag down her throat so that Mrs. Belote actually asphyxiated on that article, or I should say, that piece of cloth that was lodged in her throat. Virginia Christian was convicted of premeditated murder. And so the prosecution or the Commonwealth attorney had to establish that Virginia Christian arrived at Mrs. Belote's home with the intent of killing her. I don't believe, based on my reading and understanding of the court documents, that that was proven. That is, that premeditation was proven. But in the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Commonwealth attorney only needed to establish that Virginia Christian thought about killing Ida Belote for 2 minutes. And that's all the time that was required to establish premeditation. There's something else interesting. Oh, the other interesting aspect about her trial, or another interesting aspect about her trial, was that she had a jury of all white males, and that's not surprising in 1912. But what did surprise me is that Virginia had basically 2 qualifications for jurors. To be a juror in a civil trial, one had to be male, 25 years of age, and live in the county for 6 months or more. To be a juror in a criminal trial, one had to be male, 25 years of age, live in the county where the trial was to take place for 6 months or more, and a registered voter. And I thought, aha, that's really interesting, because having the requirement of potential jurors being registered voters for criminal trials almost guaranteed that no Blacks will be on those juries.
Yeah. Yeah. That is extremely, extremely interesting. And she was 17 years old when she was executed. How old was she? I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
She was 17 years old when she was executed. She was 16 years old when the crime was committed and she was tried. She was
Right.
executed 2 weeks after her 17th birthday.
Wow. So and you said she was the last juvenile that Virginia, like the
No,
first and the last, or
she
no?
was the first female to be put to death in Virginia's electric chair, and she
Mhm.
was the last juvenile female to be executed in the United States. There have been no other juvenile females executed
Yeah.
in the United States since her execution.
Well, that is definitely it's an interesting history for me because it is one, of course, that I've stated before that I was not aware of, but then it's also one that I don't even think a lot of us think about in terms of the criminal justice system and young people being executed in our criminal
Right,
justice system without really having a fair trial. Now, of course, in 1912, as a Black person, what are the odds that you're really going to get a fair trial anyway?
right.
But still, it's just this pattern that we even see today where, and that's one of the things that kind of makes the sentences for execution problematic for a lot of people, including myself, because there have been cases and there continue to be cases where you find that people are on death row and they are innocent, or you have a history where there's a chance that somebody who has been executed in the past was innocent of the crimes. And
Well,
because of so many factors, whether it is, the jury or the judge or, the different components, the lawyer that they were assigned to, the criminal justice system, lack of evidence, whatever the case may be, they did not necessarily receive a fair trial. And so as a result, they were convicted of a crime that they may or may not have committed, or even if they committed some aspect of said crime, does that punishment, does that give them the right to die by the state? And then this is just a question I have. As far as young men, have you done any research or found any cases where young men in the United States have been executed prior to being 18?
oh, yeah, far more than juvenile females. One of the most infamous cases took place in Louisiana, where Louisiana had something called a portable electric chair. And so they would take the electric chair from parish to parish, and parishes, as you well know, in Louisiana are counties.
Yeah.
And they would put the electric chair in an empty cell, and they would execute the prisoner there. And so there was a case in Louisiana in the 1930s or 40s, I believe, of a juvenile a juvenile male. And he was sentenced to be executed. The chair was brought to the parish where he was incarcerated, was placed into a jail cell. They put him into the chair because he was so small. His feet did not even touch the floor. And because he was so small, they had to put books underneath him so that his head would be high enough for them to put the apparatus around his head to execute him. They put the chair, as I said, they placed him in the chair, hooked it up and everything, turned on the switch, nothing happened. Tried it a few times more, nothing happened. They took him out the chair, put him back in a cell, took the chair off to be repaired. And while he was, while the chair was being repaired, attorneys representing this juvenile argued that to execute him or an attempt to execute him again would be a violation of the Eighth Amendment. And that is the amendment that protects you and me from cruel and unusual punishment.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court disagreed. The chair was brought back to the jail. He was placed in the chair and executed. And so sadly, there have been more cases of juvenile males that have been executed than juvenile females. But I want to mention that one context to sort of contemporize what happened to Virginia Christian to the laws today. We still have too many instances where juveniles are sentenced as adults.
Yeah.
And psychologists and psychiatrists have argued that the reasoning of a juvenile is not the same as the reasoning of an adult. And so you can't punish or the state should not punish a child for making what is an awful decision under or using the understanding that this child uses the same type of logic to figure out what is right and wrong as an adult would do. And so that happens too frequently. Fortunately, because of the work of a number of attorneys at Equal Justice Initiative, Southern Poverty Law Center, the ACLU, the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, juveniles can no longer be given a sentence of life without the chance of parole, because those organizations argued to do so is akin to sentencing that child to death.
Yeah.
And because that child would literally die in prison. Fortunately, that no longer happens. Or I should say that was to sentence a child to life without the chance of parole was construed by the Supreme Court of the United States as a violation of the Eighth Amendment.